This year, we mark the 50th anniversary of his assassination 50 years ago. But prior to that, you know well that Dr. King changed each one of our lives. Our speaker today is the Reverend Dr. Kenneth Wheeler. He is a retired pastor of the ELCA who received his BA in religion from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. His MDiv from Trinity Lutheran Seminary, will forgive you. Columbus, Ohio. He has served 4 called ministries and 16 congregations as an intentional interim and as an assistant to the bishop in the Greater Milwaukee Synod. But I'd like to share a personal story with you about Dr. Wheeler. Some years ago, I got a call out of the blue when he was serving Cross Lutheran Church in Milwaukee. I got a call out of the blue asking me to come and preach for their Women's History Month. Dr. Wheeler had arranged for women to preach throughout the course of that entire month. You see, he had a plan, and the plan was this. An African American woman would follow him, would be his successor. You see, not many African American women are pastors or senior pastors in church. Now, when I say senior pastor, I'm not talking about you're the only pastor, so you're the senior. I'm talking about a senior pastor, head of staff. That happens with intentionality. And so he began to sow the seeds then. And I am happy to report that Reverend Michelle De Lopez is the senior pastor at Cross Lutheran Church because there was a Reverend Dr. Kenneth Wheeler at the helm at one time and was intentional about making a big tent where all are welcome, not just in the pews, but in leadership. So when Blaine Thrasher said, hey, how about Reverend Ken Wheeler? You know, we were roommates in college. I was like, sure. So I am very happy to welcome not only Reverend Wheeler, but where's Mrs. Wheeler? In the back. We give thanks to God for your ministry together. And so the next voice you'll hear is Dr. Kenneth Wheeler.
Good morning. As I said, in the presence of the president of this fine institution, it is unusual, after not being in this place for such a long time, to hear the crunch of snow. It is not a sound that we get up to every morning in St. Louis, but it is good to be here. And it is good to be here precisely on this day as we lift up before us, gathered in this space, as we lift up before this nation, a man who still speaks to us in powerful and in clear ways. He was a dreamer. Yes, he was. But do you know that dreamers also cause agitation? And so he was an agitator. He was a prophet. Yes, he was. He was a lover of justice. Yes, he was. And that is the king that I want to speak about a little bit this morning. In the book entitled Martin Luther King, the Inconvenient Hero, Vincent Harding writes these words about King. Just a few weeks before the bullet struck, helping to explain to the children and to us whose bullet it was and why it was fired, King took his own sense of the American dilemma and challenged even further. By then, he had come to the conclusion that the black freedom struggle was actually exposing the evils that are deeply rooted in the whole structure of our nation. It reveals systemic rather than superficial flaws and suggests that radical reconstruction of society is the real issue to be faced. Harding would ask in a series of questions that you and I must answer, a series of questions that this nation must answer. And they are, who will dare to rededicate ourselves to the causes of this great hero? Who is there now when major portions of the black middle class have made their peace, found equal opportunity in the America that is? Who is there now when the overwhelming experience of the black church is still focused on an individualistic religious experience, breaking with the Tubmans and the Turners and the Trues and the Kings? Who is there now when so many of our black youth, in whom the fire once burned, are now being cooled out by drugs, by jail, by apathy, by poison cultural opium in music and on screens, by big money for playing small games? Who is there? Who is there when so many of his white comrades now stand back in cynicism and fear and success and puzzlements? Who stands a hero who insists on living for the broken and the exploited, who refuses to deny nightmares, who will not let dreams die, and is not afraid to go on exploring and stumbling and trembling wherever visions will lead them? Is he safely dead? Perhaps we should recall him and see. Perhaps in the process, we may learn again how to live unsafely in love with God and neighbor, with cleansing and purifying fire, with the America that is yet to be created by us. Harry Belafonte, that vulnerable entertainer and civil rights activist, in an op-ed piece in the Huffington Post, described what America was like in 1935. It was the world that King's parents would experience, and it would be the world that King Jr. would soon become aware of. In the words of Mr. Belafonte, it was a time when women were still second-class citizens, when Jews and other ethnic whites were looked on with suspicion, and immigrants were kept out almost completely unless they came from certain approved countries in Northern Europe where gay people dared not speak the name of their love and were passing as whites, as WASP, as heterosexual, as something, anything else that fit in with what America was supposed to be was commonplace, with all of the self-abasement and the shame that entailed. It was an America that was still ruled at its base by violence, where lynchings, and especially the threat of lynchings, was used to keep those of us with black and brown skin submissive. Martin Luther King Jr. was born into that kind of an America that was separate but equal. And though he was born into middle class, at some point he would come face to face with this cancer that was lodged deep in the American politic. He would see the signs and the symbols of Southern white supremacy that were meant to send a clear message that his life, nor any black life, would ever amount to one that was equal to a white life. He would himself feel the sting of that racism at age 6, when the mother of his 6-year-old white friend announced to him one day that he could no longer play with that little 6-year-old boy who had become his friend. There was no explanation given, but the message sent by that mother was clear, namely that young Martin was the problem, not because he had done something wrong, but because of his ontology, because he was born with black skin. Even at 6 years of age, that kind of being made to feel that you are unworthy makes an impression, a lasting impression, as profound and as deep as the first time that you are called a nigger. Sometime after his death, to this present time, we have made Dr. King a mythological figure. And by that I mean we have stripped him of his humanity. We took him from the context of history in which he lived, and we made of him an idol. We took the edge off of his truth, and we took the edge off of his truth because it would make us feel comfortable. But dreamers and dreams are meant to agitate. And the king that we are calling to mind on this day is the king who was a dreamer, but he was also an agitator. The Dr. King that mattered in the 1950s and in the 1960s is the king who was born into a real historical time frame, born into a real family, born in 1929 during the Great Depression, which created economic hardships for everybody in this country, for many Americans, both black and white, but which created even greater hardships for poor and African American citizens. He was born under the political system of Southern apartheid, which impacted his family as it did many black families in real and practical ways. A system that was really all about the unmaking of those with black skin. Can you conceive of it? What it means to live in a nation and not be recognized as a human being. Those signs that were posted over those restrooms and over those water fountains and over those doctors' waiting rooms were meant to send a message. And it was not a subtle message. Every time you would drink from that drinking fountain meant for colored, and you entered the waiting room door meant for colored, it sent a signal to you that you were less than a human being. King was close to his maternal grandmother, but when he was 12, she suffered a fatal heart attack that King blamed himself for because he had slipped out of the house and was not home when she died. King, young, was upset by her death, struggling with his own guilt and shame. He attempted to commit suicide at 12 years of age by jumping from a second-story window of the family home. King would later suffer with bouts of depression throughout his life, and much of that depression, I think, had to do with seeing what was possible in terms of advancing the cause of justice for African Americans, and not knowing that there would be no way to achieve those things without a coalition of the oppressed working together to press for that justice. But there was also a personal angst that King wrestled with that had to do with his own internal struggles, the shadows of his life, that had to do with his own personal demons. And so when I was given this assignment, I wanted to deal with that human king. I was delighted, but I was also reluctant. Delighted because King himself never saw himself as anything but human. Reluctant because, like many of you, I grew up seeing Dr. King as this great hero, untouchable. In fact, in our home, as was the case in many African American homes in the South, there were 4 pictures that hung on every wall. There was a picture of Jesus. Interestingly, that picture was always white. But nonetheless, there was the picture of Jesus. But then there was this trio of John and Robert Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. All of them were held by the majority of black folk, particularly in the South, in a sacred and holy place. I confess that I once was in that space, and so it was difficult for me to hear of some of Dr. King's failings. I remember when Ralph Abernathy wrote his autobiography in 1989 and the walls came tumbling down. I must tell you that I am a King scholar of sorts. I've read every book that was ever written by him and read most books that other folks have written about him. But that one book I held off reading for several years. I simply refused to read it because of the press that had preceded it. The book really was, it's about 600 pages. It really was about the civil rights movement through the eyes of Dr. King's closest ally, friend, brother. These two men were on the front lines. If you saw one, you saw the other. They were joined together at the hips. They were together in all of those great crusades in Albany, in Jackson, in Birmingham, in Montgomery, and in Selma. They had gone to jail together over 40 times. A book 600 pages long, but the press focused only on 2 pages, where Abernathy writes about Dr. King's marital infidelity. It was a revelation that was difficult to hear, difficult to accept. Some years ago, my wife and I had the honor of taking Dr. James Cone to the Milwaukee airport after he had spoken to a theological conference of pastors in the Greater Milwaukee Synod. As you know, Dr. Cone has written an excellent book about King and Malcolm X. But I would ask Dr. Cone on that trip to the airport what he thought and why he thought Dr. Abernathy would choose to write that book, and particularly to focus on that particular item. I remember Dr. Cone looking at me, and he simply said, his response, "Pastor, it was pure jealousy." Abernathy always felt that he was walking in the shadow of Martin Luther King, and this would be something that would put him squarely in the spotlight. But whatever his motives were, the reality that we now know to be true and documented by a number of writers, Dave Garrow in Bearing the Cross, Taylor Branch in Parting the Waters, Michael Eric Dyson in I May Not Get There With You, Ava DuVernay in the movie Selma. And in that movie, she sought to show a complex and human king by dealing with the fullness of his humanity. She dared to deal with his grace, but she also dared to deal with his demons. She exposed his joviality with friends and associates, but she also exposed the stresses that the movement had upon him. She would address the subject of his marriage and the fragility of it when Coretta confronted her husband about the contents of a tape that had been sent by her by then Director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, with what seemed to be evidence of Dr. King's unfaithfulness. And whatever one might think of this part of Dr. King's life, his moral failings, and it is not my intent to defend his actions, because Dr. King would not want anyone to defend that part of his life. In fact, he would say in a sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church, somehow the isness of our present nature is out of harmony with the eternal oughtness that forever confronts us. And this simply means that within the best of us, there is some evil, and within the worst of us, there is some good. I believe that when Dr. King spoke those words, he was wrestling. He was wrestling with these marital failures. They were in his moral rearview mirror, and it was a part of the burden that he would carry until the day that he died. These moral failings, I think, also contributed to his struggle with depression, because after each one of those episodes, he would be filled with a deep sense of guilt and shame. King would often quote in his preaching the Apostle Paul, Perhaps he liked Paul so much because Paul struggled with a thorn that was in his flesh, though that thorn is never really identified. But Paul would speak about this tension that existed between the flesh and the spirit. He would write, "The good that I wish to do, I do not, and the evil that I do not wish to do, I do." King could identify with those words. They spoke powerfully to him. But that struggle was not unique to King. That is a tension that exists within all of us. For her part, Mrs. King remained virtually silent about this, neither confirming nor denying the allegations. What she has said in her own autobiography is that neither she nor Martin ever talked about those things. What we know is that she was a faithful and loyal wife, faithful to her marriage, faithful to the legacy that her husband left, and faithful in her work to protect her husband's legacy. Before her death, the Reverend Al Sharpton had a conversation with Mrs. King, and one of the questions that he asked her was why she never remarried after Martin's death. And she was matter of fact in her answer. She said, "Because God brought Martin and I together, and I have always felt that Martin was the only man for me." Now, here's what I find disturbing. J. Edgar Hoover, who was then FBI director, mounted a massive campaign to destroy the life of an American citizen. And he would use any means necessary to do it. What I find disturbing is that a leader of our government, head of the largest law enforcement agency in the nation, would characterize Martin Luther King Jr. as the most dangerous man in America. But he would say absolutely nothing about the greatest terrorist group in this nation that night after night and day after day, with full impunity, march into black neighborhoods, pull young black men out of their beds in the midnight hour, hang them from some tree until they were sufficiently dead. A terrorist group that spent its life's work trying to terrorize those of us whose skin was black for no other reason than that they thought that our lives did not matter. Who is the greatest danger. Try, as some might have, to use King's infidelity to discredit his legacy or his greatness. I would argue that they do neither. Rather, King's weaknesses, his humanity, his flaws, his human condition, if you will, speak to us about how God is able to use ordinary people, people with flaws, people who live with shadows. How God can use ordinary people with spots and all to accomplish his purpose for greater good. And if you are not convinced of that, let me point you to the sacred text. That text that is replete with folk whom God calls, and they are flawed and imperfect. Moses, who was a murderer, but God made him a liberator. Abraham, a liar, but God made him a father of nations. David, who was perhaps the greatest king of Israel, but he was not only an adulterer, but he was also a murderer. Saul, who spent a season of his life and career persecuting the church, but God changed his name and used him to become one of the greatest missionaries that the world has ever known. God uses imperfect people, and King was aware of his blemishes. King would emerge from the March on Washington, August 28th, 1968, at the zenith of his, 1963, at the zenith of his leadership. But 2 weeks later, he would preside at the funeral of 3 of the 4 girls who were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church by a hate-filled segregationist. And in that sermon, you can hear the restrained anger in Dr. King's voice. These children, he says, these children, innocent, unoffending, beautiful, they were the victims of one of the most vicious and heinous crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. He would use this solemn moment to speak. Every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows, every politician who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He would speak to a federal government that had compromised with the undemocratic practices of Southern Dixiecrats and the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing Northern Republicans. To every Negro, he would say, who passively accepts the evil system of segregation and stands on the sidelines in the midst of a mighty struggle for justice, to every black and white person, these little girls' death says to us that we must replace caution with courage. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, and the philosophy which produced the murderers. Their deaths say to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality. But let me bring it home a little bit closer. Just as we were coming in from the airport on Saturday evening, Blaine Thrasher took us by the site where Philando Castile was murdered. I thought as I passed that site, the image of that young man sitting behind the driver's seat, pulling out his license to show to the policeman, and then the seven shots that left him dead. The officer said, "I was afraid." Well, what were you afraid of? I was afraid because of his black skin. What kind of an America? What kind of justice system? I watched the tape, and there was not just his girlfriend in the car, but there was a little girl sitting on the back seat, witnessing all of this. And as that tape was being shown, if you listen close enough, you hear the little girl sitting in the back seat, and she's saying to her mommy, "Mommy, Mommy, it's going to be all right." And I said to myself, no, it's not going to be all right. Injustice is never all right, and we ought not get comfortable when there is injustice flourishing. Prior to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was the central piece of legislation for the civil rights movement, King would write words that seem as if he is describing our current situation. He would write, "In Selma, Alabama, thousands of Negroes are courageously providing dramatic witness to the evil forces that bar our way to the all-important ballot box. They are laying bare for all the nation to see, for all the world to know, the nature of segregationist resistance. The ugly pattern of denial flourishes with insignificant differences in thousands of Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and other southern communities. Once it is exposed and challenged by the marching feet of Negro citizens, the nation will take action to cure this cancerous sore. For what is malignant in Selma must be removed by congressional surgery so that all citizens may freely exercise their right to vote without delays, without harassment, without economic intimidation, without police brutality." King, near the end of his life, would travel to Memphis to stand with black garbage workers in their fight to gain fair wages. By all accounts, he was standing, by that time, standing alone, depressed, and feeling discouraged. There were new and more radical voices, and his voice of love and nonviolence was being pushed to the background. And so on the eve of his assassination, April 3rd, 1968, he would deliver what would be his final speech. And whenever I watch the video of that moment, What strikes me is just how tired Dr. King looks. You can see the weariness in his face, a weariness born from a myriad of campaigns for black freedom and dignity. The battle scars were evidence in the lines, in the eyes, no longer a smile, a sadness. The speech that night would be a quick review of a kind of historical timeline, beginning with a mental flight by Egypt across the Red Sea, through the wilderness on toward the Promised Land. But he wouldn't stop there. He would ask the Almighty to allow him to go on to the second half of the 20th century, where he would witness a new revolution. He would witness God working in a way through men and women. In some way, strange way, he would say that something is happening in our world. The masses of people, he would say, are rising up. And wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, whether they are in Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York, Atlanta, Georgia, Memphis, Tennessee, Jackson, Mississippi, Minneapolis, Minnesota, St. Louis, Missouri, the cry is the same. I dare say the cry is the same in this century. And the cry is this: we want to be free. We want justice, and we want it now. We want our black lives to matter, and we want our black lives to matter on par with those of white lives. We want to be free. And in that same speech, King seemed to be saying that he would not be around much longer. He had made peace with himself, and he had made peace with history and his place in history. You remember his words. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, like anybody. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And by 1967, King had found a fuller voice. He had come to terms with his own death, and he spoke with a freedom that was unencumbered, ready to do God's will, and he saw the next revolution. That next revolution would be standing in solidarity with the poor and with those who had been economically oppressed. The Bible tells us that if we do not see the poor and the vulnerable and then work for their liberation, then we don't see God. We have just come through a year ago a bitter and ugly presidential campaign. And the person who now resides in the nation's house rode into office with a kind of vitriol and a hatred that has driven a deep wedge between us. The election was not just about winners and losers. Fundamentally, it was about a decision to return to an ugly time in this nation's history. I want you to be clear about this. I was born 65 years ago. In 1952, in a little village called Vicksburg, Mississippi. I said on yesterday at the worship that Vicksburg was one of the Civil War battlefields. And it was always strange to me how you can call any war civil. But that war was about determining whether or not this little boy born in 1952 as a baby, determining whether or not I mattered, determining whether or not someone with black skin mattered. This war was fought to determine whether or not I was not just a human being, but whether or not I was a human being on par with those who had white skin. And you see, that's still the question. It's still the thing that we have not figured out. We're still debating that question. Thomas Jefferson, if you remember your history, Thomas Jefferson who had slaves, Thomas Jefferson who had 16 children by a black slave, Thomas Jefferson who penned the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, Abraham Lincoln who would free the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation. But those two giants had questions about those of us with dark skin. They said, we believe that they are human, but they will never be human in the way that white folks are human. If that doesn't bother you, in 21st century America, then let me invite you not only to check your pulse, but check your hearts. If that doesn't bother you, in 2018, let me suggest that you not only check your pulse, check your heart, but check your faith. The teeth of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, which listed those states and jurisdictions that were the most egregious in denying and or blocking people's right to vote, you remember had to get pre-approval from the U.S. Attorney General or the U.S. District Courts before they could make or implement any changes to that act. That was essentially gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013, a court that was led by Anton Scalia in a majority opinion written by him, and that had the support of 5 of the 9 justices who were all conservatives. And the argument that they held, the argument that swayed the court, they said now we are in a post-racial environment. And to prove his point, Justice Scalia would cite the number of black elected officials in those southern states. He would cite the high number of black elected officials across the nation and the fact that America had elected a black man as President of the United States of America. all to suggest that America had overcome its racist past. Now here's the image. I watched the meeting between President Obama and then President-elect Donald Trump at the White House. And as I was watching that meeting, there was a bust of Dr. King sitting on a table or a desk directly behind Mr. Trump. It was a rather sober juxtaposition of a man who fought his whole life to push this nation, Dr. King, who spent his whole life to push this nation to live out the true meaning of its creed, that all people are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And a man who had just won the office as the highest elected official in this nation because he appealed to white fear and anger based on fear. We live, sadly, as a divided nation. What Mr. Trump has been able to do in a short amount of time is to drive a wedge between blacks and whites and Native Americans and Hispanics. He has put down women and characterized Mexican immigrants as criminals. He has risen to prominence by exploiting the politics of hatred and fear. I watched him as he spoke about the King holiday in a room that included the nephew of Dr. King and Ben Carson. I heard Mr. Trump say, "I love Dr. King." Same president, same man who spoke of an entire continent of people with dark skin, an entire nation of people with dark skin, characterize those people as shitholes. I love Martin Luther King. I love the King that we have enshrined and encased in myth. I love the King who is silently dead. We've taken the edge off of his truth so that his words will not agitate and disturb us. Sisters and brothers, we need some disturbance in this nation. In 2018, injustice is still rampant. Black lives do not matter. prisons are filled with young men with black and brown skins. Not because they have done hurtful things, but because of sentencing that is weighed upon them in ways that it is not weighed and distributed upon those white folk who have committed the same crimes. I jog every day, almost every day. I missed 3 days since I've been here. I drive to our local gym. And my great struggle is trying to figure out what to do with my identification. I normally will put it under my seat. And then I thought, that's probably not a smart thing. Because if I were ever stopped and the police asked for my identification, I would have to reach down under my seat. I've never owned a gun. And a policeman who comes with white skin, afraid only because they have stopped someone with black skin. I have to think about that as a 65-year-old African American male, father of 3, married for 42 years, grandfather of 5, pastor for 30 years. But that policeman who walks up to my car window doesn't know any of that, doesn't care about any of that. All he sees is a black male who reached for a license, but may end up dead. That is what our young black males live with every day. That is what their parents live with every day. To think that you can live in a country, you are African American, but the hyphen means that you still are not valued. You are still not quite a human being. In 2018. So here's my final word. We need courage today. We need courage. We need people with courage who will stand up and cry out with a clear voice against the racism, not just exhibited by this president, but who will cry out against racism and injustice, period. This is not a time for silence. This is not a time for equivocation. This is not a time for silence. We need to be clear. We need to be clear in who the enemy really is. There can't be any equivocation about that. Sometimes in my reflective moments, I think about that June night a few years ago when a young white boy decided that he wanted to kill some black folk. And he stopped at a church, Mother Emanuel, in Charleston, South Carolina. He walked into that Bible study meeting, and being the God-fearing people that those 9 black people were, they took that young white boy at his word. They welcomed him into that room. They wanted to share faith with him. I think about that he sat there with them for 1 hour through that Bible study time. But on his mind, he still had the notion that he wanted to kill some black people. And he wasn't going to let the Bible study stop him from doing that. And so he got up from his seat and he began one by one, putting a number of bullets in their body. It was an execution. The news media, they were kind. It was an execution. He killed them until they were sufficiently dead. But I was so glad, as tragic as that was, I was so glad that America's first black president was president in that moment, because he brought a word that the nation needed to hear. He brought a tone that the nation needed to hear. And I said to my wife, could you imagine if Donald Trump had been president? And him saying, well, there were good people on both sides. We've got to be clear about what we see. And we've got to speak truth to power. We cannot be silenced. It is time for the church. I was embarrassed. I still am embarrassed. But more than embarrassed, I'm troubled that 81% of white evangelical Christians voted for this president. And some of those white Christians sit in this church body. It's time for people of faith, people who are justice-loving people, people who identify themselves as disciples of Jesus, to cry out, to stand up, to resist the evil that is being given voice by this administration. I'm not afraid. At 65, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of living, and I'm not afraid of dying. I'm not afraid of being political. I'm just not afraid of that. I'm not afraid of being political in the church. I'm not afraid of that. And the reason that I'm not afraid of that is because Jesus was political. He wasn't a partisan. but he was political. The gospel was political. And if you don't believe the gospel was political, read Luke 4, where Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And then he begins to identify the people, those who are oppressed, those who have no voice, those who stand at the edge, those that the powerful do not see, those that the empire has oppressed and put their foot upon their necks. I have come to bring good news to them. Don't be afraid of being political. Those of you who are being trained to be prophets and priests, be prophets. Be prophets who dare to dream. But don't just dream safe dreams. Dream some dreams that agitates. Dream some dreams that are going to cause some people to squirm. Dream some dreams that's going to speak truth to power. Dream some dreams that will say that God has sent me down to the Pharaoh to tell you, let my people go. Dream some dreams. Cause some trouble. I have a dream. I have a dream, he said, that one day, this nation will live out the true meaning of its creed. One day. I want to suggest to you, I want to leave you with the words, well, one day is today. One day is now. We need, for voices who are clear, we need some clear dreamers to stand up. And don't be afraid to dream your dreams. Tell your dreams to the congregations that you will be called to, even if you get pushback. Well, you keep on dreaming. Keep on dreaming. I'm going to stop, and if there are questions, I'd be happy to entertain anything that is in your spirit, in your heart.
We want to thank you, Dr. Wheeler. Give it up for Dr. Wheeler. We know that Dr. King tells us to be a conductor, not to be a caboose. He tells us to be a thermostat, not a thermometer. And Dr. Wheeler, you have been that for the last 30 years. You've been a courageous leader in the ELCA, and they say that in the first ones on the beach have the most casualties and the most wounds and the most injuries, and you've been a pioneer, and I know that you could share a lot of stories of pain, and but also of amazing dreams as well. So we just thank you for your service to our church and for your prophetic wisdom. So thank you so much. I should also mention that Dr. Wheeler, as fancy as he was also willing to be a precept leader for our Christian Public Leader course this fall, which has been awesome. So we thank him for that. So does that make up for him going to Trinity, the fact that he was willing to do that? So let's have some questions now. if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll pass the mic and do this for a while here.
So first of all, thank you so much for being here and what you had to say. It was certainly what we all needed to hear. And as a white person who has been learning and growing and continues to learn and grow, I just wanted to address the white people in this room in particular and say that that's our work to do. Keep learning and growing, and it's your job to have those conversations with fellow white people. The truth is they're gonna listen to you more than they're gonna listen to a black person who gets up and says the very same thing that you are saying. So have those conversations and look within. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that in line with what you said about the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that we're called to action right now, and there is a prophet crying out right now, and that's Reverend Dr. Barber. He's the person from North Carolina who did the Moral Mondays movement, and we're in the process of bringing that movement to the whole country. And gosh, I'm just so choked up by what you had to say. I'm just, anyway, so I'm gonna read off of something really quick because I know my brain just can't come up with something in the moment. But at a time such as this, we need a new Poor People's Campaign for moral revival to help us become the state and the nation that we've not yet been. And as it says in Esther, perhaps you were made for a time such as this. So if you'd like to get involved with the new Poor People's Campaign that's picking up right where Reverend Dr. Barber left off, I'm gonna make a post in the Cohort of Cohorts page that shows you how you can sign the pledge. And you can join together to help end systemic racism, poverty, militarism, environmental destruction, and related injustices, and help change the moral narrative. So thank you for giving me the microphone for a minute, just to try to hopefully encourage others to get involved and build that fusion coalition that Dr. King was dreaming of. Thank you.
Thank you for lifting up Dr. Barber. He is an amazing voice. And if you would like to learn more, just Google his name, and in fact, you will find out all of the things that you've just heard from this young person here. He is an incredible voice, and in fact, I do believe that he has picked up the torch. So thank you for that. The other thing that I wanted to share, there's an amazing book. Michael Eric Dyson is an amazing writer, but this book is actually, he writes this book for white people. It is entitled Tears We Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America. But there is a chapter in this book where he addresses the whole reality of whiteness. And one of the most powerful things that he says is that whiteness, it has nothing to do with your DNA. Whiteness has nothing to do with your DNA. You were born a human being, but you assumed the context of whiteness. And whiteness is a political, sociological construct that has to do with power. But whiteness, if you buy into that, it robs you of your humanity. You cannot be a human being and claim the reality of whiteness. In fact, you have no soul if you cling to the idea that your whiteness gives you privilege over someone else. So I want those of you who are white to struggle with that. I said this yesterday at the forum at St. Anthony Park Lutheran. Dr. King, by the end of his life, do you know, his conclusion about America was that America was indeed racist. Those were his words. He was shocked by how deep and prolific racism was in America. He was shocked. And so he concluded that racism will kill America. He started out, if you remember, he started out by saying that this movement, which was a moral movement, this movement of freedom, it was not about civil rights, it was about freedom, that we are invested in this movement to save the soul of America.
If someone else has a question, you can just come on up to the mic, either of these mics here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I don't know if this is on. I have a big mouth though, right? Thank you. Good morning. My name is Gia Starr Brown, and I'm a senior here at Luther Seminary, and it's an honor to hear you speak. I am really curious, as I'm pursuing my MDiv degree here, considering this day and age, I'm wondering what leaders in the church inspire and encourage you as a person of color as you continue to press forward, and what advice you would give a person of color, a seminarian, as they're moving forward.
That's an excellent question. So one of the things that encourage me, I'm going to invite Blaine Thrasher, if he's to stand up. I attended, both my wife and I attended Concordia College, which is in the northern part of the state, where no black people live. And we were there from 1970 to 1974. I joined a gospel team, and so we traveled much of the Midwest. And one of the first places we traveled to was Montana, which is where I met this young man. He was 15 years of age at the time. I was 18. And he tells the story of kind of following us around. He was so impressed with us. Blaine and I became good friends. He eventually became a student at Concordia. We became good friends. We've been friends for over 45 years. And when I say friend, I don't say that lightly. And so the signs of hope are people like this. And there are many people like Blaine Thrasher that you will discover in the church. And so those are the signs of hope. And they're the signs of hope that will give you the energy, the power, the faith to address the systemic racism, because that's there. It is larger than the individual. That systemic stuff is there. It's there, and you have to be aware of it. You are entering a church that is a part of an institution that was shaped in the context of an America that practiced racism. And it was not just in the South, but all over. The church is a part of that. But it is those individual relationships that will be light to you, that will feed you, that will feed your soul. The second thing that I would say, it is important that you surround yourself with people of color who, when you get beat up, because you're going to get beat up, when you get beat up, that you know that you have a place to go and you can just cry or you can rant. And you know that you can do that because you are in the safety and the care of people who love you. There is no way, Maya Angelou said, that if you're black in America, no matter how much success you've attained, you're going to be reminded at some point that you are still black. And when you are reminded of that, you need to be clear and you need to be sure that there's a community that you can go home to that will shore you up and that will care for your soul. So those are the places of light that I've found. My family has been a source of strength. My wife, we've been married for 42 years. We raised 3 wonderful sons. And so there were points, my wife always knew when when I had gotten beaten up. And sometimes, she would say a word, and sometimes she would just hug me. But at all times, I knew that she had my back. So that community piece is just critical. That gives you the courage to walk and to keep going. That's what I would say. Yeah.
My name is Ron Letness. I graduated from Concordia, Ken, so I can appreciate what you say. I was a graduate from Luther Seminary just in 1971. And I remember when Father James Groppe came to speak down at Osgard Hall. And the room was packed. And finally he got to his conclusion. He kind of yelled like you. And but he said, if you do not believe, that black people, and white people, are not equal in the sight of God and are equally welcome in the church, and he yelled this twice, get the hell out of the church! And I remember, of course, just being good, kind Lutherans, we were kind of jolted, by that. But I think the church is in a Bonhoeffer moment, and just given what is being said about the character of our nation and the character of our people, I think are being challenged, as well as the character of the church. I've been involved in the church for many years, and overwhelmingly, what I have heard from the Lutheran Church and from Lutheran pulpits is a focus on forgiveness and grace and reconciliation. Fantastic message. But what I have also not heard is a focus on how it affects the world, making the connections with real life. I remember what Bonhoeffer said. He said, you cannot experience the reality of the world without the reality of God, nor the reality of God without the reality of the world. And to all of you seminarians, I want you to get into the world as well as the Word, because they go together. I don't want to just hear, something about Jerusalem. I want to hear something about the streets and something about the rich and the poor and the economics and the militaristic chaos in this country. I want to hear about the world as well as the Word. Please. Jesus died on the cross. And the question that I have always been struck by is, what does it mean that Jesus Christ didn't die in bed? And so you, as budding seminarians and the rest of us, who are part of the church, we need to risk. I appreciate what you say about courage. That's exactly what we need. Jesus had courage. Paul had courage. Martin Luther King had courage. They all died, and some of them died viciously. And we have a theology as Lutherans that embraces that, because we are taught to be theologians of the cross. And so let's grab it and do it and be led and empowered by it. We are the church. And our God is Jesus Christ. Wow! So let's do it. But thank you for your message. Appreciate that, Ken.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wheeler. I felt indicted when President Trump described people from Haiti and Africa, and he referenced shithole. And he juxtaposed that with the attraction of people from Norway. And I couldn't help but think about our church and being representative of that kind of thinking too. So I'm wondering what reflection you would have.
Yeah, that's a whole nother lecture. And then for him to say this morning that he's not a racist. And I think, again, this is where I think we have to be clear. Let me answer your question this way. I've been a Lutheran for over 50 years. I started out in Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. I went to an ALCA college and an ALC seminary, graduated from both of those places, not a bad student. But, and I've had some successes, but I've also had some pain. And the pain has had to do with the fact that that we have never been accepted as full Lutherans. We've always had to prove ourselves. And that hurts when you, so when the church picks up the practice of the national character and refuses to be countercultural, to be in the world, but not of the world. So we've got some reckoning to do. I said, the example that I used, and folks just, sometimes it's grating when folks want us to get over slavery. Or get over Jim Crow segregation. I remember the first time that I was called a nigger. I was 8 years old. I remember exactly the place I was standing when I was called that word. I remember being in a store with my father, who was much older than my mother, and the clerk giving my father back some change, but saying, "Here, boy." My father was old enough to be my father, old enough to be that young boy's grandfather. And so you tell us to get over that. which is like adding insult to injury. And so yesterday I said, you don't tell women who've been raped to get over it, because they've been traumatized. You don't tell that little girl that was sitting in the back of Philando Castile's car, who saw with her own eyes the image picked up in her own heart and in her own being. You don't tell her to get over it if there is no psychological help for her to do that. Chances are there won't be psychological help for her. So she will grow up with an image that will cause pain, probably for the rest of her life. And you expect her to get over it. Slavery was traumatic for those of us with dark skin. Living in the South for 17 years, you may say that's not a long time, but 17 years, a lot can happen in 17 years. When you hear your own parents being disrespected, called out of their names by children who are your age or younger, because they have been taught that that is the way that they should relate to those of us with dark skin. It is even more painful when we have people sitting in our pews who are white, who bring those attitudes into church, and who look at the black pastor who is standing in front of them, who has an education on equal par with their white comrades, if not more, and yet are not respected in the same way as a white colleague who may not have, who may be mediocre. So I want to be clear. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we have the president of the seminary here, I would say this to every seminary president if they were sitting in this room, because I think Bonhoeffer, when he spent a year in America, from 1930 to 1931, he chose to spend his time in Harlem. He chose to worship at an all-black congregation, Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York. Why did he do that? He learned some things that he didn't know. Reggie Williams, who is the author of the book Bonhoeffer and the Harlem Renaissance, or Bonhoeffer and the Black Jesus, said that when Bonhoeffer first set foot on the shores of America, he came as an incomplete person. But by the time he left, he had found his fullness. Where did he find his fullness? He found it in a black church. Where did he find his fullness? He found it sitting with black poets and reading black poets, sitting with people like James Baldwin. And then he said that he was disappointed in the white church. He was also disappointed with Union Theological Seminary because they didn't get it. And what didn't they get? They could talk about Jesus and yet ignore the reality of racial oppression in this nation. So he said, you cannot have Jesus if you do not realize that you also must deal with those who suffer.
Amen.
And he concluded that racism is a theological issue. I don't know what the courses are in seminaries now, but it seems to me that the church needs to deal with racism as a theological issue.
Yes.
It is not an add-on. It is not an add-on. It is central.
Yes.
Racism is about stewardship. It's about the preservation of life. And our theologians, those who teach our students, need to be clear about that. It is a matter of life and death. Racism is killing us. It's killing us. It's killing our souls. It is leaving us less and less of a human being. So I think for seminaries to really begin to grapple with this issue, not as an add-on, not as an extra, not as something that you do in J-term, but it becomes a core subject. And we begin to deal with that from a theological. The only way that we fight evil is to make sure that we are strong in Bible, but also strong in theology. Racism is about theology. It's a bad theology. So that would be, Reggie Williams is an incredible professor. There's the new Sojourner magazine that's coming out. The cover, I think it's February 18th that it comes out, but he deals with the Bonhoeffer for our times. There's a connection between Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King. All right, I got it.
Dr. Wheeler, sorry, we have to set up here for worship as well, but can we just thank Dr. Wheeler one more time for presenting today? Thank you so much.
We're going to take a little break here so Dr. Wheeler can catch his breath as we prepare for worship. All are welcome, and all means all. And I just got back from Texas, 6.5 months, so all means all y'all. So you all are welcome to come to worship, and then there will be a community meal that we may discuss all that we have heard and visit a little bit with Dr. Wheeler. Thank you for coming out.
executive session.